When I was growing up, my favorite movie was The Truman Show. Even now, I get goosebumps just listening to the soundtrack. Jim Carrey plays Truman Burbank, a man who leads an ordinary life, which, unbeknownst to him, is secretly filmed and televised 24/7 for a global audience. Everyone in Truman's world is in on it. They're actors getting a paycheck, but they're playing Truman's wife, parents, childhood best friend, everyone he's ever known. It's a life that's meticulously protected, guided, and overseen. There's a lot that's unnerving about the movie, but one part that I always find notable is that this TV show, The Truman Show, is popular. They show people watching it, lifelong fans, viewers who put it on every night as they go to sleep. The public is captivated by the real, ordinary life of a guy they've never met. The Truman Show came out in 1998, right before the reality TV boom was about to kick off. MTV's The Real World came out in 1992, but around 2000, we started to get shows like Big Brother, The Amazing Race, The Mole, American Idol, and that train is still rocking, easily skating into the streaming age with similar shows on Netflix and other platforms. Scripted television still has its place, but there's no denying the allure of seeing real people apparently live their real lives in front of a sea of cameras. We know it's not like real, but it's still real. And if it's real, then it can potentially provide evidence about everyday psychology. Going back to the early 90s, social scientists have occasionally analyzed game shows to test hypotheses about risky decision-making. From bets placed on the show Jeopardy, to choices on Deal or No Deal, to bids on The Price is Right. Televised decisions have helped test economic theory. But can we do the same for social psychological theories? One of the clear champions of the reality TV era is Survivor, which first aired in 2000, and it's still going. The finale of its first season was seen by more than 51 million people, the second most viewed piece of television that decade. People were captivated by the social dynamics on display, and 43 seasons later, the show is this recurring social experiment, pumping out data that we can now analyze to see whether getting voted off the island could be rife with discrimination. You're listening to Opinion Science, the show about our opinions, where they come from, and how they change. I'm Andy Luttrell, and this week I talked to Erin O'Mara Kunz, whose analysis of racial and gender discrimination on Survivor is hot off the presses. Erin is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Dayton, and she studies the self and social identity. We spend the whole episode digging into how Survivor is a useful test case for understanding discrimination, what the data tell us, and what conclusions we can reasonably take away. What is your personal relationship with Survivor? Like, is it a show that you've been obsessed with for a long time? Or is this like the scientists saw it and said, this is a thing to study? What does Survivor mean to you?
So it's kind of a combination of both. I think I know it started out as being a show that I just really enjoyed watching. I remember watching the finale my sophomore year in college with our friends. They lived next door, and we all joined together in our common room and watched the finale of the very first season of the show. And I was hooked at that point. So I've been watching the show for now, I believe it's over 20 years. So they do 2 seasons, right? Yeah. They do 2 seasons a year. And they kept it going pretty much through the pandemic. They made some modifications to the structure of it, but they kept it going. So it's on right now, season 44 is airing. And so it's 22 years. So throughout, I wasn't born a social psychologist. I guess maybe I was, but I didn't realize it at the beginning. And so when I was in college, I was a psych major. Didn't really approach it from a psychological perspective. And but like any good psychologist, we know that most of the time, 1 or 2 observations isn't really going to give us much information about anything. And so it took a while of watching it over the years where I would just be at home watching it with either my mom, who's also a giant fan, or I've converted my husband to be a fan of the show, and just kept noticing the same pattern of people being voted out of the show first. I feel like that's probably the most jarring outcome that is recognizable watching it. And so I would be watching the show and often joke like, well, okay, we're going to see, a woman or a non-white contestant get voted out first. And very often I would be right, with greater than chance, right. And so I said when I had gotten my faculty job, I would joke and say, once I get tenure, I'm going to look at this. I'm going to actually test whether there's really a difference, and there's a bias, a race and gender bias, or is it just something that I'm observing and it's sort of like a correspondence bias type thing. And so I ultimately got tenure and decided to look at it.
So let's before we get too deep in the weeds on that, I want to roll back the tape a little bit because I've actually never watched Survivor.
Okay.
and I imagine there are people in the world still somehow, a few of us left who haven't seen it. Because you were saying the longevity of it. I kind of remember it circa 2006. Is that right?
Okay.
Like, was that when do you know when Survivor started?
It started, so the finale of the first season was in August of 2000.
Whoa.
So it started in 2000.
Yeah, so truly. So I guess that makes sense given the years that you've been throwing out, 22 or so years. Wow. Yeah, so I was in like middle school maybe.
Oh my God.
When this came out. So here's what I know of the show. Like basically I know what I've picked up in pop culture and from reading your paper. Mostly my association is like small torches on like an island setting. Somehow people are competing with each other. They're like deciding amongst themselves who leaves, right? So it's not like a producer coming in or like judges coming in and saying you're gone today. It's people making those choices for themselves so they can be sort of strategic about who they collectively vote off the island. I mean, like that's even a phrase we have now, to be voted off the island.
Right.
Just a Survivor
Came
thing.
from Survivor.
So that's all I know. So like what is actually like someone shows up on this island and what is their goal?
So the goal of the show is to be crowned the sole survivor. And the sole survivor wins $1 million. And so to do that, there's different stages of the game. And throughout the 3 years of the show, it's pretty much followed the same recipe for the structure of the show. So when there's anywhere between 16 and 20 contestants on a given season, and when the game starts, they begin broken up into different teams, which they call tribes. And so there could be anywhere from 2 to 4 tribes, depending on how many people are in the show that season. And then at that point of the game, they compete as a team against the other tribes. And so the tribe that wins typically gets either a reward, if it's a reward challenge, or they'll get immunity if it's an immunity challenge, which means they're safe and none of them will go home that night. The tribe that loses, they will, if it's a reward challenge, they just don't get anything. But if it's a immunity challenge, they will have to vote off one of their team members, one of their tribe mates at tribal council that night. So in that case, the tribe that loses will go to tribal council, in which they sit around a fire. That's when they bring the torches, right? They get to bring their torches with them, and they sit around a fire. And it's always sort of decorated differently each season, depending on where they go. And they talk with the host of the show, who's Jeff Probst. And apparently it goes on for hours. We only see a couple of minutes, maybe 10 minutes of it, 15 minutes of it on the show. And the host will ask them questions, sort of probe, try to see what is going on in terms of group dynamics. And, we'll ask a whole bunch of questions. And then they ultimately have to go decide who to vote for. And it's a private vote. So they get up from the group, they go over to the voting area. They have to say the name out loud of the person they voted for, and they write it on a parchment and then put it in like an urn type thing. And then after everyone's voted, the host will come out, read the votes, and somebody goes home. And so that's the beginning of the game. Then, I don't know, maybe between like 13 and 17 days of the game, something like that, the tribes merge together. So now you take who's ever remaining from each tribe, and it all becomes an every person for themselves game. So now everybody's playing as individuals. So you can win individual reward challenges or individual immunity challenges. And really, that's the only way to stay safe, to make sure that you're not going to go home, is to get individual immunity. And so at that point of the game, usually what happens is whoever gets voted off, so whoever wins immunity is safe, and then they all have to vote off somebody else who's remaining. And those folks who are voted off at that stage typically become jury members. And so they are sort of these silent watchers of the rest of the game, of tribal councils. And at the end of the game, when there's either 2 or 3 players left. And so now when the jury is, the jury's either talking to the 2 finalists or the 3 finalists, and the jury ultimately decides who wins. So the people that you participated in voting out now decide who gets to win the game. And so whoever gets the most votes at that point for the win wins the game.
Gotcha. So, but what are the actual like, I'm trying to zero in on what is this decision that people are making about each other? Like, why would I vote someone off? Like, because there has to be some consensus in order for this person actually to leave. Right. And do you have a sense of like, what are the general considerations that they're supposed to be making? Like, why would I get voted off of this island?
Sure. So the motivation for voting seems to really shift throughout the game. So at the beginning, you're motivated, in order to keep yourself there, your team has to win. That's the only way to stay safe. And so there seems to be more of a motivation to get rid of the quote unquote weaker tribe mates. Many of the challenges, not all, but many of the challenges that they do as tribes are physical strength related, or they're puzzle related. Not really endurance, but a lot of like running and swimming, things like that, digging in sand. And so their strength is often lauded as being something you want to maintain. And oftentimes there are people on the show where they've performed so poorly in a challenge that they leave themselves open to as the obvious person that should be voted off. However, that said, there have been times recently in the current season where there was a player who was injured and had their arm in a makeshift sling and still didn't get voted off. You would have thought that was a no-brainer based on the idea that you'd want to keep your tribe physically strong in order to compete well. So that seems to be what people talk about as the driving force behind at least early vote out.
Because in the beginning of the game, you're trying, like, your task is for your group to keep advancing, right? And not lose.
Right, exactly.
And so you're trying to preserve something about your group that you think is a winning strategy. But then it flips later in the game, right? Now it's like everyone for themselves.
Yep.
And so let's say this would never happen. Let's say I make it to the second half of the season. Why might someone kick me off at that point?
So at that point, the people who were kept around in the earlier stage of the game, they kind of have a disadvantage because if they don't win the immunity challenges to keep themselves safe, they really are more likely to be voted off at that point because they're too strong, they're too much of a threat for the other contestants. So stronger people are often talked about as being who should get targeted at that stage. People who consistently win challenges, they'll often target folks who have won like 2 or 3 in a row and get them off because they're obviously showing that they're a threat to win the game. Something that's happened in more recent years, again, I don't know how many, but contestants have often talked a lot about like building a resume of vote off or like moves that they've made that they could be that can be attributed to them to kind of earn the respect of the jury. And so people who are too strategic or who have done too many good moves, you may want to get them off because their resume is stronger than yours. So there's different types of strength, I think, that people target at that stage of the game, or at least they say that they target at that stage of the game.
Okay, so there are lots of these little decisions that people are making on this show throughout
Yes.
the season.
Yes.
Who to vote off of your tribe, who to vote off in general, how do you advance,
Right.
knowing who's going to be deciding your fate at the end. And
Yes.
so in all of those decisions, the premise, as I understand it, is that at
Hmm.
least some of that decision making seems to be motivated by racial and demographic biases, just generally speaking. Based on, I mean, like, and I do know at least that this is like a criticism of the show, that people have just sort of
Hmm.
like informally picked up on this. Have there been moments where like this has been like fan outrage at what seems to be demographic bias?
There have been there's been a lot of contestant outrage. So for former contestants, they've been very vocal about the not only the treatment that they've received based on their race, but also the edit that they've received from production. So there's been a lot of criticism towards production about the way that people have been portrayed, like in very stereotypical manners. So, stereotypes about Black people being lazy. They would often show, one of the Black contestants could have just built a fire and gathered wood, but they would show a lot of video footage of them laying at camp, right after having done, something to contribute to life there. And so there have been a lot of criticisms early on in the show of that. There was a contestant who was kicked off the show for inappropriate sexual contact not against the contestant. He did inappropriately touch a contestant several times, and she asked him to stop and complain to production. But it wasn't until he actually did it to a producer that he got removed from the show. And then in more recent seasons, like since the pandemic started, there have been a lot more intentional discussions about race that occur on the show during a lot of the tribal councils that we've seen. And then I've read other things that show that contestants have behind the scenes things that didn't make it on air, had discussions with each other about racial and gender dynamics while they were there. And so I think there's been a lot of, on the contestant front, them doing their part to try to illuminate these issues. I only recently became a member of a Facebook survivor group, so I'm not really in like online survivor worlds. But there seems to be a bit of a sort of like whether there's racial and gender bias is sort of a polarizing topic. It seems there's a contingency of fans who are very aware of it and sort of like, no kidding, we know this is going on, this is bad. But then there's another contingency that is just like, it's a game, they're voting out the weak people, women are weak, tough, like deal with it. And so there's sort of this bipolar distribution of people.
Nevertheless, I mean, at this stage, it's all pretty anecdotal. I mean, some of it's pretty darn damning, but like to say that it's like a systematic thing that's going on with the show or with any aspect of it is like at this point still kind of open to examination. So you decide to do it. You got your tenure. You go, I'm going to do the Survivor project.
Yes.
And what does it actually look like? Like
it.
Somehow you have to translate, 40 seasons of a TV show into numbers on a computer.
Yes.
How can you possibly look at this systematically?
So what I did in collaboration with some research assistants, very dedicated research assistants and grad student research assistants, was we created just a massive Excel file where we started with season 1 and entered data for each person. And so luckily, there are websites that have cataloged basically every move of these contestants throughout the show. And so there's the one website I used was the Survivor Wiki, and then True Dark Times is another website that I used and would often fill in gaps from the CBS website. But those websites have like an incredible amount of data. And so it made it much easier to, get information about the contestants at the time of the show and then since then. And so we were able to look at, they break things down based on like how many votes each person got while they were on the show, what day they were voted out, the order in which they were voted out. So we were able to look at those websites for each season of the show, for each contestant on each season, and then basically take that information and manually extract it and put it into our data set. I know there's probably more sophisticated ways of doing it. We just did not know how to do them. So we did it the old fashioned way and just looked at data and put it in the data set.
What I love about it is it's kind of like reverse crowdsourcing, right? You're like,
Yeah.
the crowdsourcing already happened before you knew you wanted to get these data. And people just were already recording it. I mean, it sort of strikes me that that's an interesting future avenue of work that we could do, like taking advantage of this bizarre corner of the internet that catalogs and diagrams TV shows and say like, oh, like this is more readily available for analysis than the show itself is. I guess the concern that I would have is that, I mean, you're hoping that these are reliable metrics.
Right.
And in particular, when you're talking about the identities of people, and I mean, how many, like what total number of contestants are in the data set over the years?
731.
Which is, it's a good number of people. Do you have any sense of like how well the demographic information would sync up with how people self-identify? Or in other words, like how are those categorizations made?
So one of the websites that I used categorized people based on different racial demographics. And so but I would go through and try to check. I would, for most of the contestants, go back through and see, and Google them and try to look up information online to verify the racial category that they had been put into based on, I don't know who the person behind the wiki is, but thank you for everything. And just to verify that kind of stuff. And I did find myself watching many of the seasons again as I was working on this to kind of verify different points of it, different pieces of it. If something didn't look like it made sense, I investigated it to try to understand better what was going on. Some of the seasons get a little confusing because they vote people out, but they go to a different island, and then they come back in the game. And so like the order of things is a little, it can get a little confusing at times. So I had to really go back over those seasons and make sure that things were being recorded properly.
Okay, so the data are in. You've got numbers for everything, all these decisions that people are making in this game. And so what do you look to quantify whether there is any degree of bias? It seems like you look at a handful of discrete decisions or like parameters and test whether those demonstrate any evidence of bias. So what do you find? Were you right? Was your hunch there? Or was this absolutely, I could have, I mean, if we're talking, I think people know probably what happened rather than like, oh, I spent 3 years documenting a TV show and I just got no results. So what do you look at and what do you find?
So prior to looking at the data, my colleagues and I identified, and these were sort of different, there are different points in the game that I feel like are important and for different reasons. So like the first thing that we looked at was the first person to be voted out of their tribe. So, which was a good way of thinking about it, because there's the first person voted out of the game, which is just one per show. But there's often, anywhere from 2 to 4 tribes. So we were able to increase our sample size and calculate from each tribe when they voted someone out, if they did, was there a racial and gender bias for those votes? I've looked at it both ways since, and the findings are consistent. The first person voted out of the game for each of we only looked at seasons 1 through 40, and 41, I believe, had just finished airing when we were analyzing the data, but it's different enough from the first 40 to justify not looking at it as part of this. And so, and I can talk more about that. But so we looked at the first person voted out of their tribe, which usually occurs pretty early in the game, right? So day 3 is the first time somebody's voted out of the game. You often don't know people very well then. and you're still getting to know each other. And so we wanted to look at that as a decision, in part because when you don't really know people, you kind of rely on stereotypes and sort of group level information to often make decisions. And so we looked at, again, averaging across all of the seasons, whether there's the first person voted out was more likely to be white or a person of color, and then a man or woman. Survivor just dichotomizes gender into male and female. And we found a bias for both. No interaction, but a bias for both groups. And so people who are white are less likely to be voted out of the game first from their tribe, and people who are men are less likely to be voted out. So women and contestants of color are more likely to be voted out first. So when I was observing that at home and thinking this looks like a pattern, it confirmed that it was indeed a pattern. And even if you just look at the first person voted out of the show each season, it's consistent with those findings.
And is it, just to be clear, this is, I forget how, like what the comparison was. So is this like relative to the number of women, let's say, in a given season? Or is it just like more often it's a woman who gets voted off first than a man? Like what's the comparison?
So we compare, so on each season of the show is, except for one season, because a contestant couldn't begin the show at the very last minute, there's an equal number of men and women on the show. So the cast is always 50% male, 50% female. But the cast is overwhelmingly white from seasons 1 through 40. And so anywhere from there was 2 seasons where they had 15 out of the 20 contestants were not white. One of those seasons was because the tribes were broken down by race. So there was a white tribe, a Hispanic tribe, a Black tribe, and an Asian tribe. But in general, there's overwhelmingly white contestants on seasons 1 through 40. And so that made it particularly interesting, because what we really cared about was whether women and contestants of color were being voted out disproportionate to the representation in the game. So it was taking into account that they represent, this small percentage. Are they being voted out at a rate higher than what you'd expect, given their representation in the game? And so, we talk about in the paper too, that if people were just doing this by chance, there's more white people. So if you were randomly picking a name out of a hat, you should pick a white person's name. But we found the exact opposite. And yeah, so that was our first outcome that we looked at, was the first person voted out of their tribe to test for bias. And then we looked at whether contestants made the merge or not. So the merge is when the tribes dissolve and everybody becomes one big group to play the game for themselves. And that's a really important part, because at that point, if you make the merge, if you've made it past the group stage and you get to the merge, you have the potential to control your fate a little bit more. And so you can win individual immunity. I mean, not everybody can. I probably wouldn't. But you can, there's a chance, right? You have a little bit more control over your fate. And so are people from underrepresented groups and women, are they given that opportunity to get there and control their fate? And so we found that women and contestants of color were also less likely to make it to the merge. So the merge was overwhelmingly, disproportionately white and male across all 40 seasons.
And so this also mirrors the survival analysis that you did, which is just like, so there's a statistical technique called survival analysis. And if ever it would be perfect to use something called survival analysis, it would be an analysis of the gameplay on the show Survivor. So
Yes.
What is this, like, what is this bias, this version of looking at the data?
So when we did the survival analysis, we looked at the day that each person was voted out of the game. And so the game is 39 days long, and you can last anywhere from, again, like 1 to 39 days. There were some seasons where people were voted out on the first day of the show, but typically people aren't voted out till day 3. And so we calculated the likelihood that people would survive 2 given days of the show based on their race and gender. And so what we found was that, and that analysis, there was an interaction between gender and race. And so we broke it down into 4 groups. So white men, white women, non-white men, non-white women, because there's typically, with the exception of this season that broke things down by race, there's there's 4 or 5 people on each season that aren't white. And so we weren't able to look at it any more nuanced than that, unfortunately. And so when you look at the analysis that way, you basically create a curve that predicts how long people would have survived on Survivor. And there's it doesn't really look in the paper, it doesn't look like a clear bias, but it is a clear bias that seems to advantage white men, where white men last the longest. They're more likely to last to 39 days than all the other groups. And non-white women, women of color, are least likely to. So they're particularly disadvantaged in the game.
Is another way you could frame that women of color are especially likely to drop out of the game early? Could you interpret it that way?
I wouldn't use the phrase drop out. I would say get eliminated or get voted out. Yeah, because I feel like it's and that was something that a reviewer brought up too, like very, very intentional about our language regarding that, because really it's not a choice, and they seem to be targeted a little bit more than the other demographic groups.
Okay, so all of these data points point to a pretty clear bias. It's not huge, I don't think, by the numbers, but it's like definitely there, right? That like women of color in particular are disadvantaged in this game. White men are quite likely to make it into the latter half of the game. But you also looked at some other indicators of bias that I think by and large were not super compelling as evidence of bias. So what decision points do we not see these demographics playing a huge role?
So we also looked at likelihood of becoming a finalist. So the next sort of stage of the game is, do you get chosen to be a finalist? Like, do you make it that far? And there was no bias related to gender or race at that point of the game. So proportionate to or relative to the proportion of contestants of a given race and gender, there's no difference in terms of the likelihood of you making it to that point. There was sort of a trend that contestants of color were more likely to. It didn't reach significance, but there was sort of this trend that was interesting to see, that the contestants of color, both men and women, were more likely to be a finalist than you would have expected given their proportion in the show. But it didn't reach statistical significance. And despite the fact that they may have been like slightly overrepresented in finalists, they still weren't. There was no difference in winning based on race, but there was a difference based on gender. So men are more likely to win than women. So I was mostly right, but like a little bit not right.
I mean, it sort of makes sense to me, especially when you framed that first to be voted out analysis as like, it's so early in the game, people don't have a lot of information about each other, and so they're more likely to default to these sort of simpler biases. And if you think of, the totality of the psychology of bias, that makes total sense, right? Like, it's in the absence of individuating information that we lean on stereotypes and these kinds of things. But now in retrospect, it makes some sense to me that later in the game, you'd see these things play less and less, have less and less influence as people have more individual information about each other, as they've had more opportunities for contact, getting to know one another as individuals. And also, it just seems like the rules get so weird in terms of like, who do I vote off? Like, it's not the logic of who to vote off, as you described it, seems pretty clear in those early days.
Right.
The logic and mind games of the latter half are just like, who knows what people are doing? And like, if there's a bias, what would it even really mean exactly at that stage of the game? And so interesting that there's still some evidence of bias, but it's actually, to me, in hindsight, a little more reasonable to expect that even though there are biases earlier in the game, they fade away by the time the game closes. Does that sort of comport with how you think about it too?
Yeah, I think it's pretty consistent with, um, I feel like the biases early in the game are certainly more visible. And I also think that, like, as a casual viewer of the show, I feel like over time, if you consistently watch it, people notice the earlier biases. I also think the winning bias it stands out a bit. I was actually surprised that there wasn't a bias for race for winning, but again, it's proportionate to the initial representation in the game. So that's really why. Like, if we were to have looked at it, a 50-50 chance of, and for looking at winners, we did the analysis separately for race and gender because we limited it to, for gender, final groups of finalists that have men and women in it. And then, for race, groups of finalists that have a contestant that is white and, not white. And so at least one. And so I was a little bit surprised to not see a race effect pop up with winning, but I was unfortunately not surprised about the gender effect. Very kind of because of the way that people have to play the game. So I think when you watch the show, you often see contestants being, they have to lie, they have to backstab, they're a little cutthroat. And so those are things that men sort of get a lot more of a pass on than women do. And so women are often held to a different standard in terms of their behavior and what's okay for, men and women to do. And so when it comes to the final decision, it's not entirely surprising that there's a gender bias, given that men and women are often held to different standards about what is deserving of winning or what is, good gameplay. And, somebody on Twitter asked me, gotta love Twitter, who played better? That's who should win. And I said, how do you define playing better? And I think it's very, idiosyncratic for each season, like what their norms are about playing better and who played the better game for that group of, like, their dynamics. But you'll often see women not being given credit for things or not being sort of lauded the way that men are for different moves that they've made, and, or getting a little bit more, sort of penalized for things that they have to do in order to survive, right? So, lying to friends, voting people in their alliance off, things like that.
It sort of is like the thing that makes these reality game shows compelling is the ambiguity in what is a good performance, right? Like,
Hmm.
you're like, no one knows. Like, they cut to commercial and you go, I don't know who's going to leave. Who's it going to be, this person or that person? Like, that's what
Hmm.
makes it engaging. And of
Hmm.
course, that ambiguity is where all of these kinds of biases can seep in. Whereas,
Yep.
like, I'm going to guess on Price is Right, we're not going to see a lot of those disparities, because you're
Yeah.
like, it's just truly, if whoever gets closer without going over,
Right.
that's it. That's the whole game. Like, no,
Yeah.
there's no judge needed. It's just the
Exactly.
number that
It's
gets
not it's
closest.
not subjective.
Yeah. So it's sort of like, yeah, like this is exactly the kind of circumstance in which you might expect these things to happen. But I'm still kind
Right.
of curious, like, why? So your explanation makes sense, I think, as the sort of
Hmm.
like, what is good gameplay, what is
Right.
tolerable, as like a Machiavellian approach to playing Survivor. But you also have some analyses where you try to rule out this explanation that, like, oh,
Yes.
maybe it's just the case that some of these contestants by happenstance are stronger or smarter,
Right.
and that's why they're staying in the game. And it's confounded with race and gender, but it's not necessarily like a
Right.
bias, a discriminating bias.
Hmm.
So how do you try to rule that out?
So one of the things you'll often hear is that, like I said earlier, that people will vote out the weak members. And so what I did was I had a group of students at, my university go through, I think they each rated about 100 photos, the cast photos
Hmm.
of the contestants from the CBS website. And I had them rate the contestants just by looking at them on a number of different traits. So all of the traits that we had them evaluate are in the supplemental document. But the two that I was particularly interested in looking at for this paper was perceived physical strength and perceived intelligence, because those are two things that often are named by contestants as factors that impact, whether they're going to vote somebody out. And so we looked at whether physical attractiveness, that was another thing that we assessed. I didn't look at it though. But perceived physical strength from just a third party onlooker was related to being voted out first, and each of these outcomes, making the merge, being a finalist, and winning. And it wasn't. So there was interestingly, men of color were rated as being more physically strong, but they're also a part of a group that was more likely to be voted out first. So in doing that analysis, we were able to essentially eliminate at least, third-party perceived strength as a potential explanation. And same thing with intelligence. We were able to, that was not related to any of the outcomes. And so it suggests that people were perhaps not using those indicators as important factors when voting for contestants to be voted out.
The interesting thing about that to me is so you find, like you said, that, for example, contestants of color were rated more physically strong than white contestants. And that still is a little ambiguous as to whether that's these particular people who are on the show are actually stronger than these particular people who are on the show, versus it's revealing a stereotype, which we already know is the case, right? People have these stereotypes about physical strength. And so in some ways it's also so at least it also can say that these stereotypes may not be the things that are biasing decisions, potentially. Well, maybe. It just left me wondering, okay, so if it's not that, what is it actually? What is the nature of this bias that's getting people kicked off early, right? It could be that they're given less credit, right? But it's not perceived intelligence that seems to be doing it. It's not perceived strength that seems to be doing it. So why else? And here's where it's a black box, right? You don't know, because you get to interview these people or see what happens or control anything.
Right.
But do you have a sense of here's why these are people who leave the show early or voted off the show early?
I think what it really comes down to, from a social psychological perspective, is just in-group bias. I think that, for seasons 1 through 40, the majority of the contestants are white. So this, I think, explains, or at least is a potential explanation for the racial bias, that you have mostly white contestants. And so if you are in a tribe of people, that tribe is going to be mostly white, and maybe one person of color, two perhaps. And so if you have a group of mostly white people and you have to make decisions about who to vote off, you're going to create in groups from that group, in groups and out groups. And I think that's just one of the most common criteria that people use to create in groups and out groups. When it comes to gender bias, it's a little bit tricky, because typically there's an equal number of men and women in the tribes, which means that women have to be turning on women in order for this to happen. Otherwise, you'd be at a stalemate and there would be a tie every time. And there's sort of penalties in the show for having a tie. You don't really want to have a tie, but and so there seems to be some, we talked about it in the paper, some, internalized sexism and basically aversive sexism, right? Where people aren't necessarily aware that they have these biases, but in situations that really lack the structure of how to guide you to not behave in a biased way, you're often likely to see these stereotypes and these biases impacting your decision making. And so, I think even if I were to have interviewed all 731 contestants, I would guess that the majority of them would not have any awareness that this played a role in their decision making, and would probably argue that it had nothing to do with their decision making. I'm sure there are, I'm going to assume that most of the people who have been on the show are not overtly racist and sexist, but some may be, I guess, more okay with being that than others. And so, but most people probably have, just like most people, in life, have biases that they're not necessarily aware of at a really high level. And so they often impact decision making when things are ambiguous, right? When you have to, make a decision about somebody, you see these in-group, out-group groups being created and favoritism for your in-group. And so I think a lot of it comes down to sort of just like basic group dynamics and, the way that social psychologists explain group behavior.
Do these wikis also have a record of who voted for whom? Is that knowable information?
They do.
Oh,
yeah. So
second wave.
we could get in pretty deep here. Yeah.
I mean, because you could test, you could probe that in-group bias question by looking at who's voting for whom.
Yep. And we looked at voting we just put it in the supplemental analysis, but we looked at number of votes received to win the game based on race and gender. And there was a gender bias. So women receive less votes, which makes sense because women were less likely to win. But we wanted to look at that as sort of another outcome to try to understand what the difference was essentially between these two groups.
Do you have a sense, so in a vote like that, you only need to barely be in the majority to actually win, right? And so it could be that you go there's that scales tip ever so slightly and consistently in men's favor. But if you look at the votes, is it like a huge gap, or is it just as narrow as you'd? Yeah, it's a big gap. Okay.
Yeah, it's a big gap. I mean, there are many seasons where women are among the finalists and they receive no votes.
Oof.
I mean, there's been a handful of seasons, at least, where it's a clean sweep in terms of who wins. Everybody votes for the same person. I just also watched Survivor Australia, and we saw that happen in Survivor Australia because I've gone international now with my viewing. And so sometimes it's the case where there's one person who is so dominating as a player that everybody votes for them. More often, there's a bit of a split. There was one season where there was two male contestants and a female contestant, and it was a tie between the two male contestants for the final vote to win. The female contestant got no votes, and she had to cast the ultimate tiebreaker vote for the winner. And so it's not uncommon for women to receive 0 votes at the final tribal council.
So it's not just ever so slight of a majority. Wow.
Right. I don't have the exact numbers for you. It might be in the supplemental material, but it's not, the men are not winning by 1 vote every time.
Got it. Okay. Okay. So the concern that I have, so this is all curious, and a skeptic or a critic could say, of course, this is on TV, this is for entertainment, this is ramping up things. This isn't really a good reflection of what everyday life is like. Even a more cynical take is the producers are ultimately running the show and they know what's going to get people to stay engaged. I mean, we know that there are some media biases where they go well, who is the audience we're trying to appeal to? And so maybe we try deliberately to keep certain people around in order to keep people on board. So the cynical take is all you're seeing is a product of these sort of mechanical decisions that producers are making for a piece of television entertainment. I'm guessing that's probably not the conclusion that you draw when you think about these data. So I'm curious, how, to you, in what way is this a legitimate reflection of bias that exists in our everyday worlds and not just an artifact of entertainment?
So, I mean, having not been on the show, I can't really speak to how much producers are shaping strategies and voting and things like that. It seems like, at least from a viewer perspective, that it's one of the more hands-off shows in terms of producers being involved in who should stay and who should go. Right. I think I watch a lot of reality TV, and there are other shows where I could say the producers absolutely make selections about who should stay and who should leave. And it's been, past contestants have talked about it. And so, but for this show, there really hasn't been, aside from the producers being sort of called out for biased editing. There doesn't seem to be strong information coming from contestants on the show that their voting was really shaped by producer involvement. So I feel like if that was really playing a strong role, we would have kind of heard about it by now. But so I'm gonna be optimistic in that that's not happening here, or at least not to the extent that it would impact things over 40 seasons consistently in a systematic way.
that is helpful to say that like these are real decisions that people are making. The other side of it is to say like, okay, most of my life is not spent making decisions about people on an island with torches surrounding me. Is there any reason to go, yeah, but like, aren't we though? So how do you see, I mean, this is sort of a general point about like, is reality TV real, or like what is it that these cameras are doing to people? Mm-hmm. To throw it back to you, sort of what's your take on that approach?
So I think I mean, again, right, we're not all in an island competing for $1 million and having to vote people off and things like that. But we do have to make decisions about people in different contexts throughout life. So, if you are, high up at a company and you're making decisions about who to hire, right? So what kind of things do you what kind of things do you value? There's often a lot of ambiguity when it comes to hiring. And there have been some great studies showing that when there's ambiguity in an applicant's how well they fit the position, that's when biases creep in. And so I think, in a lot of the literature, we've talked about like the role of just sort of situational ambiguity. And I think life has a lot of situational ambiguity in it. And we often are in situations where like social norms will guide us and tell us what's right and wrong, how to behave. But we also have a lot of situations where norms don't really tell us how to behave, where we have to make decisions about a lot of different things. Like even, who do you want to be friends with in college when you are, deciding who to sit next to in class, right? Those kinds of things, those are decisions. We don't necessarily think about them as being these big high stakes decisions, but those can be decisions where biases might creep in depending on, is there a person from your racial in-group sitting here and a racial out-group sitting here? Who do you pick to sit next to? And so I think it obviously doesn't mirror the context that we live in typically, but I think it definitely does have a lot of similarities to how people make decisions in real life. When in terms of the role that biases play. And again, these are biases that are operating at a very, a very subconscious level that we're often really unaware of.
Nice. Well, this is all super interesting, and congrats on finally doing this project that you dreamed of for so long.
Thank you very much.
Should I start watching Survivor?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And so I will say too that it's interesting because from season 41 to now 44, right before season 41 started, CBS made the decision to, for all of their unscripted reality shows, they would have half of the contestants for every show would be contestants of color. And so now for Survivor, this mostly applies, I think, to Survivor and Big Brother, which is another show people have talked about that has rampant bias in it, that the contestants are 50% white, 50% non-white. And so you would think that that would help, particularly at the beginning with these first votes. And it doesn't. I've looked at the data for there have been 3 tribes for each season of the show since 41, 42, 43, and 44. And only 2 men have been voted out first in 4 seasons out of 12 tribes.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, this all seems to mirror like societal changes, right? You go like, oh, we're solving these problems, and then you go, hey, let's look at the data again. Let's see how much improvement. Oh, Well,
Yeah, not really much. So the current season, the first 4 people voted out were women. 2 of them were women of color, and there seems to be I forget what the numbers are, but there's more women of color than white women being voted out as well. So that sort of double jeopardy for women of color is persisting, even though there's seemingly better representation. But a lot of in talking with different groups of people since the paper came out, a lot of people who are fans of the show don't really feel like casting 50% non-white is having the intended effect, right? It's a start, but it's not really enough.
Mm-hmm.
So.
All right. Well, I'm not perfectly convinced to start watching Survivor, but I'll consider it. And at the very least, I'll be happy to share the work that you've done. And thanks so much for taking the time to talk about it.
Thanks so much.
Alrighty, that'll do it for another episode of Opinion Science. Thank you so much to Erin O'Mara Kunz for taking the time to talk about this new study. Check out the episode webpage for a link to Erin's website and to her new paper out now in Psychological Science. You can also find links to other things that came up today. For more about this show, tippy-tap your way to opinionsciencepodcast.com for all the past episodes, for ways to donate to keep the show running, and to other fun things. Subscribe to this show wherever you like to listen to podcasts, probably wherever you're listening to this now, and follow @OpinionSciPod on Twitter. And as always, a kind word or two and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever is an easy way to be a big help to the show. Oh yeah, and if you listened to the last episode of this show, you'll know that I was recently in a bidding war on eBay. You'll be happy to know that I got the thing that I wanted, okay? Thank goodness. I know you've been worried about that, so I just wanted to let you know that we're good now, okay? All right, that's it for me. See you in a couple weeks for more Opinion Science. Bye-bye.